Why do restaurants do not account for the size difference of sexual dimorphism in humans yet? Or in other words, why do we still have only one portion size? So now, in general, one could assume that, or it would be reasonable to assume, that there is a difference in many humans. And this difference is that a few of these humans are actually, on average, 9% taller and 16.5% heavier. So now, in order to, as a restaurant, now increase consumer satisfaction, you have, or one of the levers you have is to increase or decrease the size of a meal. So now, given all other things about this meal are consistent, the macro and the micronutrients and also the ratios, then you have basically two choices. You can increase or decrease the size of a given meal, and therefore also the caloric energy that people can expend out of this meal. So now, the problem that arises is the following, or the thesis, the hypothesis I at least had in my mind was this. It probably is better to have a few consumers over-satiated than a few consumers under-satiated. So therefore, it would make reasonable sense to increase the size of the meal to account for the fact that males are on average 9% taller and 16.5% heavier, at least in the United States. So now, this leaves the males satiated, but now the females are oversatiated, usually with a given meal. Of course, they now could potentially share the meal, but there is also kind of a social burden to not being able to eat what is on the plate. In many countries, I guess, and maybe all around the world, having something left on the plate is actually not considered a good thing, because often in restaurants it is directly correlated to how much food waste a restaurant produces. And also at home, it doesn't really, or often just doesn't really make sense, because if you think about it in terms of contamination with viruses and bacteria and so on, from the moment on you eat from a plate, you already are touching it, at least with your fork. So therefore, having something, for example, in a bigger pot that is still in the bigger pot, and only having used the bigger spoon in order to, for example, pour syrup into now a smaller plate, this leaves you with the thing that has already been touched by a fork, because it is already on a plate, as potentially being more contaminated. Therefore, also from this perspective, it makes sense. And since in the past, contaminations with viruses and bacteria and so on have been something that has impacted human lives and how we live our lives very much, and also still is impacting. And the recent pandemic is, of course, a very good example of this. It makes sense to try to reduce the waste and try to increase what is left in the source compared to what is on the plate, because also you don't want to take a plate, for example, in a restaurant and just put it back into the main source. For example, the big pot that is still full with soup. Therefore, I think it would be reasonable to assume that restaurants usually target their meals more towards the male side, because the male side otherwise would be under-satiated if the female side would be the one that is normally satiated. So therefore, again, if we now assume, and we still assume, that over-satiation is better than under-satiation, if we assume basically equal units of decreasing or increasing customer satisfaction in total, then, and we also assume that 50% of customers are usually female and 50% of customers are usually male, and also are adult, obviously, because there are also people who are not yet people yet, because they are just children, and therefore they don't also need these meals. Now, another side story would be, or a side quest you could also say, would be to discuss what the average children-sized meal then looks like, for which age class actually this now targets. And in terms of children, it now basically goes to the other side of the spectrum. Why? Because females, I think, usually, at least according to my knowledge, begin to grow a little bit earlier. So therefore, over the whole children's life of from 0 to 18, you could just assume, if you want to finish a children's life, not a children's life, but the period of a human's life, which we call usually growing up and being a teenager, from 0 to 18, then the question again is, where exactly is the average? Where is a children's portion? Now, given the fact that from maybe 0 to 4 years old, it doesn't really make sense for children to get their own portion, or maybe from 0 to 3 years old. And before this, obviously, we have the children eating something completely different, not completely different, but usually, or some, it's from, I don't know, 0 to 1, 0 to 2, children being able not really to chew something properly. So now, the question, of course, is, let's just assume it is from, let's just say, 3 years or 4 years to 18 years, with, of course, the option of the children on teenagers then choosing the adult portions already, which would then result usually, if we again assume that up until age 18, most children and teenagers aren't fully grown yet, in an oversatiation of their caloric needs. Now, of course, I'm completely leaving out the discussion of how to use the macro and micronutrient levers and how to prepare the food actually, and how this increases or decreases satiation in the short term and customer satiety in the long term. I actually just switched these two, because obviously both satiation and satisfaction are words that can be used for satiety. So now, one could argue that in the phase of children and teenagers, where there actually are children and teenagers, male children and teenagers are usually at a disadvantage because they are usually smaller and therefore eat more. But of course, there is also, in children that are actually still growing, a caloric portion or a certain portion of their caloric intake that goes towards growing. Maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 25%. Depends on the rate of growth. But adults aren't growing anymore. Therefore, you could also argue that children just need a little bit more food all the time. Now, let's return to the overall landscape of restaurants and meals. Of course, if you are at home, you can prepare your meal on your own. But also for just the average meal size in general, which we could just assume is 2,000 calories a day divided by 3. The question arises for which sex it is actually for. And now using sex more in a biological sense rather than in a sense of cultural and social identity and so on and so forth. Usually the word, I think, at least from my understanding, that is used then is gender. Now, obviously, the fact that the portion sizes are just the portion sizes that they are is also largely based on the fact that if a restaurant offers already 10 different menu items, which are all normal meal sizes and different meals basically, and it would then differentiate even further for females and for males basically, with maybe then accounting for either the 9% taller or the 16.5% heavier. And if we assume that weight is a better proxy for basically the caloric intake or the caloric need than how tall somebody is or the height, then it again would make sense to say that we kind of just offer two different portions. One that is 16.5% more and one that is 16.5% less. But this, of course, only is the average. So now, then, of course, there are also kind of social and cultural effects this could have. If we said that we have two different kind of portion sizes, of course, this then doesn't leave out the discussion, or actually kind of probably increases the discussion of females versus males and all the different new gender identities we have now, at least from my understanding again. I am well aware that it would make more sense in terms of a long-term strategy to completely avoid these topics, because they are currently so controversial. But at least I try to, at least in my mind, I try to give my best to portray the situation from my current understanding, which again might not be enough. But what I'm trying to say is that if we have again this distinction, this dualistic distinction of males and female portion sizes, then of course a female that is as tall as an average male, or as heavy as an average male, or has as many muscles as an average male, then just might choose the male portion size. And this of course then might lead to other effects, of other downstream effects. Again, in terms of the restaurants, it's just a simplification strategy. Of course, we already often have children portion sizes, and adult portion sizes. But this distinction, of course, also is not really something that will be sustainable over long periods of time. At least if we assume that there is technological advancement and so on and so forth, and also that we as a society, as a human society, that our perception of the importance of health begins to increase over time. So therefore, if we assume this, then I think it would be reasonable to assume again that over time people will also, if technology makes this easier and easier, just have more and more access to the health information and just try to manage their health better than before. Maybe with smart devices like watches, for example, that then track your blood sugar already. And Samsung, for example, already has proposed in the past, or there has been some speculation that Samsung actually could have something like a blood sugar tracker in one of the watches, but up until now we haven't gotten one of these. So I think it would be reasonable to assume that the importance of health over time only begins to increase, at least in the perception of the people that are living today, because that is actually the thing that allows us to still live. It is the fact that we still have time left. And of course, it is not the fact that we still have time left, but much more the fact that we still have health left that then allows us to sustain ourselves over longer periods of time. The time itself doesn't judge us for being alive or not being alive. But as time goes on, our health declines. And that's usually, I guess, what gets people then eventually to decease. And one of these steps to therefore increase long-term health, and therefore increase long-term health and also lifespan, would be to adapt the actual nutrient needs, the macro and the micronutrient needs, and also maybe the other needs somebody could have, or the opportunity cost needs someone could have from food, and to adapt them not to a very simplistic, general, standard approach, default approach for everybody, but instead individualize the approach for a person's specific needs. Because if a person is only 160 centimeters tall, then also maybe the female portion that is then more steered towards the average female size, ranging from some countries with 151 centimeters and other countries to 170 centimeters in the Netherlands, for example. So therefore, we also have kind of a variety, which, of course, if we individualize it down to a country, for example, would already make sense, because a country is actually often just a collection or a subset of the bigger gene pool that is the human gene pool. And of course, people who live in closer proximity to, in at least geographic proximity to each other, will have, or are more likely probably, to have similar genes and therefore also have similar results. Basically, similar height phenotypes, you could say. In conclusion, the not existing difference in portion sizes for females and males at restaurants, and just in general, is kind of a leftover, at least currently, of a society that wasn't able to adapt to an individual's needs very specifically. And therefore, maybe the future of restaurants, I mean, ideally, would look something like a restaurant actually accounting for the different caloric needs, maybe also accounting for the nutritional style you actually choose, maybe in order to optimize your mental performance, maybe in order to optimize your athletic performance, and so on and so forth. Maybe also accounting for the fact that some people might choose in the future, or more people might choose not to eat 3 times a day, but maybe 2 times a day, maybe 1 time a day. So therefore, of course, the meal also has to look different depending on how many times a day a person eats, and also how much a person already has eaten, and also how active this person in general is, but also how active this person on this specific day is, how high or how low their iron values are, for example, in the blood, which we cannot measure continuously as of now, and most people even don't measure it continuously manually. But in the future, I think it makes more and more sense to adapt nutrition, maybe also other factors like sleep and so on, to an individual's specific needs, and deviating from the general consensus that is the default, that is the standard, that is currently accounting also for the difference between females and males, or actually rather not accounting for this difference, at least when it comes to restaurants, meal services, and how they calculate their portion sizes.